Welcome to our September Crescendo Connect Conversation. My name is Lisa Griebel, and I am president of Crescendo Inc. I am just so thrilled to see all of these wonderful EI practitioners joining our call, and so thank you for taking time out of your day to participate in our call today. Before we begin, I'd like to just set the context for Crescendo Connect Conversations. So the purpose of these conversations is to provide you with an opportunity to learn about how practitioners are building emotional intelligence into their practices. Today, Bill Jeffries is going to be sharing an overview of how he incorporates emotional intelligence into the selection and development process that he uses when he's working with his clients. So as you listen to this presentation, I encourage you to think about how you might be able to apply some of the practices that he's talking about to your own work. Before we get started with the actual presentation, though, I want to do a quick review of the EQI 2.0 model of emotional intelligence. MHS Multi-Health Systems defines emotional intelligence as a set of emotional and social skills that influence the way we perceive and express ourselves, develop and maintain social relationships, cope with challenges, and use emotional information in an effective and meaningful way. So as we look at the model, what we see here is that emotional intelligence is at the core of the model, and it's surrounded by these 15 emotional competencies or EI skills. And these 15 competencies serve as the building blocks for developing and enhancing our emotional and social functioning, our overall well-being, as well as our overall performance. So starting with self-perception, generally speaking, people that have a good understanding of who they are, so their strengths, their limitations, emotional self-awareness, that they have directionally, they have a good sense of where they want to take their lives, self-actualization, and they feel confident in the skills that they're bringing both to their work and in their life in general, so self-regard. Generally speaking, people that have a strong self-perception will likely be able to express themselves in constructive ways. And being able to express ourselves constructively will contribute to our ability to be able to develop and maintain mutually satisfying relationships or interpersonal. But also having a deep understanding of how emotions play out inside of us will contribute to our ability to be able to make better decisions as well as manage our stress. So with the EQI 2.0 as a backdrop, I am happy to introduce you and welcome you to Bill Jeffries. Bill is a longtime friend and colleague, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think that Bill was part of one of our very first EQI certification programs and with the original EQI, and he's just been a tremendous advocate for Crescendo over these many years. He's got a very impressive resume, and I just want to share a few of the highlights. Bill completed his undergraduate work at West Point. He did his graduate studies at Duke University and his postgraduate work through the University of Heidelberg in Germany. He is president and CEO of Executive Strategies International and offers a variety of coaching, training, and assessment services, including leadership and team development, diversity education, culture change, innovation, emotional intelligence, psychological type, and much, much more worldwide. Bill works with senior business, military, and political leaders, as well as professional athletes. Bottom line, He's a really impressive guy with impeccable credentials, and we're going to learn a lot from Bill today. So with that, I would invite you to join me in welcoming Bill Jeffries as today's Crescendo Connect presenter. Bill?
Lisa, thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us. I was saying, as some of you are signing in, that it's always nice to talk to folks who really have a passion for emotional intelligence, who understand the subject, and are involved in sharing this with other people. That's not always the case, as I'm sure you know. Our time together today is to be spent looking at two aspects of emotional intelligence and uses of it. One is the hiring, and the other is the developing. Part of that, no doubt, most of you do. The developing part is what we do for a living, many of us. The hiring part may be a bit more controversial for some of you. So I'll spend my time initially looking at that and then moving into the developmental process as well. I'm going to ask Lisa to change the slides for us because we had a little problem actually doing that. About 3 years ago, I was keynoting a diversity conference for Facebook, and this is how Mark introduced me. You may see his comments online from time to time. They've been shared many times since that time. And he essentially said, as we all know, that high intelligence does not necessarily make the ideal employee. And what he was saying essentially was that intelligence has become a mere commodity. We expect it. People do not get by these days in large and complex organizations unless they're smart enough. And so it's just a commodity. And we have to go past that to do something different and different uses of it. So we'll go to the next slide. And so why did Mark make this claim? He made the claim because, as many of us know from our work, that new ideas simply do not sink in when emotions come into play. And we know now all the research says that outside of our work, we rarely ever use our rational brains. Other things come into play. And we know for a fact right now that those with average IQs in the workplace outperform those with the highest IQs over 2/3 of the time. And so what makes the difference? That's the work that we do for the most part. What makes the difference is emotional intelligence. Next slide. So assessing emotional intelligence, some of you use different forms, I'm sure. As I survey the world, and we work in about 35 different countries, I have found almost 18 different assessments that claim to measure emotional intelligence in different ways. Of those 18, only 4 are scientifically validated, and MHS owns all of those, which is the good news. And our bias is that the EQI is by far the best, which is why we will use that and only that. I'm sure some of you probably use the workplace report, some use the leadership report. Because of the kind of work that we do, we simply always use the leadership report. It's a personal bias, but it's one that we use mostly. And I'm going to talk about that primarily today. But regardless of what form you use or what report you use, what we're going to talk about has equal applicability. They all work with what we're going to talk about. Our clientele, well, we'll give the EQI to anybody who asks us to. Any organization that calls us up, we'll work with them. But for the most part, our clientele is an executive rank clientele, general managers on up, and specializing in C-suite executives. That's our background group. So the information, the data that I might share with you, it comes mostly from that part of the organizational world. Next. So using the EQI to find the right person. Here's where it starts getting a little controversial, I'm sure, for some of you. What I do not mean by that is that one size fits all. We do not administer the EQI and say, oh, here your results look like this, therefore you should or you should not, or we want you or don't want you. That's not what we mean. As you all know, there are high scores and low scores, and we have to spend some time explaining what high scores and low scores mean. Because unlike an academic course where a high score always wins, as we all know, I hope, high score does not necessarily win on the EQI. There are good points and bad points about scoring very high and also very low. And we have to be knowledgeable enough to know which is most appropriate at which time for the work that they're doing. So what we do not do with someone who's being hired is to say, you do or don't do this, therefore you are or are not a fit to the organization. Many companies try and do that. Many organizations try and do that. I think it is dumb, and I think it's also unethical. Most organizations for years spend time administering one survey after the next to new employees in an effort to identify the norm for that job or that career field. The norm's an outdated concept. If you want to be an exceptional organization these days, we don't want the norm. You want people who are outside the norm. And unfortunately, most of the assessments that were used up to about 2005 did just that. If you've ever read the book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and I certainly hope you do, it's a landmark book. He identifies that statistical outlier and why that outlier is so important to create an exceptional organization, whether that's a high school baseball team or a Fortune 100 company. Several years ago, I was asked by the deans of Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, and Georgia Tech to write what they call an organizational response to Gladwell. And so I wrote a book called Outliers, The Curse of Polarity Thinking. And what that goes to the heart of it are those things that have to change internally to an organization before outliers begins to make sense. But to do that, we have to address culture. And for us, picking the right person for any organization, culture is the key. We analyze that first. In other words, we look at what aspects of emotional intelligence does the organization truly value or seem to value based upon the aggregate scores of folks, and which aspects of emotional intelligence are missing or may be helpful to work better with their client, their employees, their corporation, their strategy, and so forth. So we look at culture first, and then which aspects of EI are there and may also be missing. Next slide, please. When we talk about culture, I'm talking about these things primarily. So we look at an organization's culture, we do it from the standpoint of why do they exist, what's their purpose for existing, what their vision of success looks like, what their core values are. Do they have a clear mission? Have they identified roles and responsibilities? What are their norms, the metrics? Stuff that most of us use when we look at organizational structure. They are what philosophers would call necessary conditions, but not sufficient conditions to build high performance. And so if you really identify a culture, we start with those things, but recognize that each one of those and other aspects will have an emotional intelligence component associated with it. Next slide. There were several great books on culture. This will be one that I wrote a few years back. And then I identify 15 different kinds of culture. And we look at which aspects of emotional intelligence fit with each one of those. Next slide. So what we do not do is to try to match the applicant to the culture. What I try to do is to match the culture to the applicant. I'm going to reverse that process. Normally, we've been called in to work with an organization first, and we worked with a management team or a leadership team. And to do that, I want to spend a day or two or three, if I can, as much as I can leverage, to actually create a sense of understanding culture and where the team happens to be. In our case, and I'm sure you may use different models, in our case, they always take the Myers-Briggs type indicator. If a client won't take the Myers-Briggs for us, we don't come, period. That's just my bias. Because we find it so successful, they can go someplace else. So we will have Myers-Briggs the team, we'll look at their temperament, we will also administer the EQI. And I will spend at least 1 to 2 full days with the management team on just the emotional intelligence assessment so that they understand what it says, what it does not say, what the terms mean, what they do not mean, and begin to use that as a way of them helping to understand what their culture looks like, what's going well, and what do they still need. So we identify the culture from the standpoint of the pluses and the minuses, from the standpoint of emotional intelligence. We analyze, we summarize that data for the team. And in the process of doing that, again, this is not a quick process. I demand 1 to 3 days essentially to do all this. We find the top 5 or 6 emotional intelligence competencies that are there. What's currently done well, we identify those. We then spend a lot of time with this team looking at what do they think their employees really need for more effective leadership. What do their employees need? What do their customers need? What should they expect? And we identify what the outliers are. What's missing? What could they do better? And we identify specifically which of the 15 scales in the EQI that Lisa just reviewed we believe are the most critical for their success. Our job is to help organizations become more successful than they are right now. And we're convinced that the EQI is the process for doing just that. And then as we look at candidates, we look for candidates who fit those competencies and those which can complete maybe the missing ones in the process. Next slide. So here's our candidate process. Sometimes it means we get rung up by the HR VP or one of the unit presidents, and they say, we got 3 or 4 internal employees we're looking at. Can you help us identify who might be the best fit for us? Or what happens most often with us is that we get contacted by a search firm. We're not headhunters. We don't find people, but we work with the 3 or 4 largest executive search firms in the world. And the firm will call us up and say, we've been asked to administer the EQI. Can you take care of that for us? More than happy to do that. So we administer the EQI to the candidate, and I'll get more specific about this process in a few minutes. We administer the EQI to the candidate. We guarantee with that candidate the confidentiality of their results. In other words, no results leave our hand to go to the headhunter, to the search firm, or to the company unless the candidate gives us that permission. I spent 5 years teaching philosophy and ethics at West Point, and later taught ethics at the War College for several years. Ethics is a big issue for us. And so the ethical application of how we do this hiring is critical for us, as it should I think, for all of us. We then meet with the candidate. These days, currently it's on Zoom, FaceTime, Teams, Microsoft Teams, or Slack. Usually an hour meeting. I ask them to schedule an hour on their schedule. Sometimes takes more, sometimes less, but an hour is a good start. Just to debrief them individually on their leadership report. In the process of that debriefing, I discuss with them specifically the culture of the hiring organization. I have secured the permission of the organization to do just that before meeting with the candidate. We look at the pluses and the minuses, what they do well, what they do not do so well. I want it to be very clear to the candidate the kind of organization they're joining and where they might be an outlier or where they might really be able to assist this organization in growing even further. And we discuss what their fit will be, what's missing, what's not missing. And then we secure permission from the candidate to forward the results to either the search firm or to the company itself who's looking for this candidate. I can tell you we've worked with maybe 400 or 500 senior executives over the last 10 years. I've had one only who said, please don't forward it, only one. The rest are so excited about what they've seen. They realize there's a chance for growth, either inside or outside, and they're excited about the process. They're excited, by the way, that a search firm would actually ask them to do this. They're excited by the fact that a company really cares about their emotional intelligence and their ability to relate to employees and others, that they would do this before even hiring them. So we find an exciting process, and they do too. So we also ask them to have completed the action plan. At the back of the EQI leadership report. I think it's page 23 and 24, as I recall. And just have that in their hip pocket. And what we tell them is, as part of the interview process, don't be surprised. If you're asked, hey, I see that in a specific area, you're not maybe where we'd like you to be in that area. Do you have any plans going forward? How are you going to improve that? And they can whip out that action plan and say, yeah, we're thinking about that right now. Here's how I'm doing it. So do the action plan. And then we even may meet sometimes with the hiring manager, sometimes the president of the company, or sometimes just the HR VP. That's the general process. And I'll get more specific as we talk about it. Next slide, please, Lisa. So here's a recent specific case. This is just last month. This is how it normally works for us. So last month I got rung up. It's the number 3 ranked executive search firm in the world. They're pretty large. It's not a corporation, not a firm that people go to for job searches. But companies hire them, as many of you probably know, and they go out and they search people and currently very successful in a certain job who might be interested in a change, but we don't know for sure. And they said to me, they said, Bill, we got a defense contractor, large defense contractor in North America, who's looking for a new vice president of contracts. The search firm had identified 29 contacts worldwide. They do that through their resume, through interview process. They've got people all over the world to do the interviews. And by looking at all the various credentials, they've identified 29 contacts that seem to work for this specific job. They narrowed the list down using their internal processes to the top 5. Then they asked me, they said, the client would like to see the EI data on these 5 finalists. Would you be willing to do that? So absolutely, we'll do that. So the client then is contacted by the search firm. I asked them to contact the client first of all and tell them, hey, this guy named Jeffries is going to reach out to you. I don't just want to be some kind of email that pops up asking people to take an assessment, because that tends to go to the trash file. But I then know that I'll be contacting them. They make the virtual introduction. I then send the candidates instructions to complete the EQI. They complete it. I tell them once they've completed it, please notify me. I give my cell phone to do that by a text or email to say the results are done. I want to get them involved in the process early on, just with that little administrative detail. And then I say I'll retrieve the results and forward it to them. I will forward them their report about 24 hours in advance of our meeting. I want them to look it over and read it over. I want them to know something, but not too much, before this initial contact, and have that report ready in front of them when I contact them. We then meet by Zoom or telephone. I explain to them individually my ethical obligation. And what that ethical obligation is, I tell them, is my obligation is to you as an individual. It is not to the company, it's not to the search firm. My obligation is to you as an individual. And if there's anything I say to you that you prefer I not tell somebody else, I won't. If you prefer not to have your report forwarded, I will not. So I explain, these are your results to use as you see fit. But I try to solicit their approval to send it forward. If asked by the company or the search firm, I also rank order the candidates. If I get 5 candidates, for example, I'll rank them 1 through 5. I don't check these people out on LinkedIn. I want to know nothing about them. I want to use pure emotional intelligence data. I rely upon the search firm or the internal HR VP, if it's an internal candidate, to have done that work and to know all about these people. And I find the more I know about outside influences, the more I'm likely to make a poor decision regarding the EI data. So I just want pure emotional intelligence data. Next slide, please. So the first piece of data I want to gather for them is what the overall emotional intelligence is. The top of the form, it's page 5, as you know, I'm sure. And I just want overall emotional intelligence data. That's a starting point. Next slide. I'll just kind of call it some of the data that I find important. As I'm sure you know from your background, your use of the EI, emotional intelligence form, that what we call a well-developed emotional capacity, that's like 115 to 135. That's the scores, 115 to 135. Scores 86 to 114 are the ones you most often find. That's a typical business community, typical scientific community, healthcare services, senior education people. And what that indicates to me is usually very adaptive emotional capacity. I think this comes from Stein's work out of MHS. These folks are very coachable. And if they're coached, by the way, with a good coach, we can see discernible improvement, anywhere from 10 to 25 points, I find, inside of 3 to 4 months. But they're very coachable. And that's usually the community of folks we're getting. Scores that are 70 to 85, that's an underdeveloped emotional skill. If they're going to be coached, I suggest that should be fairly extended coaching. And if the scores are under 70, that's a markedly low score. While they have the greatest potential for improvement, I will not be recommending them for hiring for a company, period, for all kinds of reasons. So I mean, they're just typical, we all know those scores and just want to review those for our processes. Next slide, please. I then want to know as best possible about this organization, since I've worked with them, what the organization's average overall emotional intelligence is. I use average for the most part. If you have some outlying scores, you may find means are more appropriate, but I find average is pretty useful. Particularly if I've had a chance to work with this company's leadership development program, I will have had data on lots of folks. So I can say overall what the overall organization's average is. And then I want to look at what the senior leadership bar looks like, compare to that. How's that overall average compare to that senior leadership bar, the gold bar on the form? Just information going in that I will use as part of the process. Next slide, please. I also look at the well-being indicator. The well-being indicator, that's page, I think, 22 on the survey. So in this particular case, I've got 5 candidates. The 5 candidates are those 5 red asterisks you see at the bottom of the bar there. I will have known what the overall organization looks like. And I know what the senior leadership bar looks like, what the gold bar looks like. This is my use of this particular page. What I have found is that when a new hire or potential new hire is being looked at, if they are at anywhere from 75 on down, almost 80 on down, it's not somebody, again, that I'm at all interested in forwarding. I find they just are not successful, regardless of what the overall scores are internally. At the same time, a very high score, the top of the gold bar, let's say 125 to 130, If people score there, I get suspicious. I'm suspicious because I want to say, if life is so sweet right now, why do you want a job change? Why are you interested in shifting gears? Why jump ship if life is so good right now? There may be good and sufficient reasons for that, but I want to use that information as part of our conversation just to let them know that I'm interested in knowing that, and so will the committee that is hiring that person internally want to know that. So it's a starting point, more data that's background information. Again, I'll get more specific here in just a couple minutes. Next page, please. So here's the kind of data I developed. There's a lot of stuff on this page. Let me kind of review what's here and why I collect this kind of data. When I have worked with a senior team, any kind of management team for an organization, I tried to give them a sense of where they stand vis-a-vis other companies or organizations in their same arena of business. So I try and show them 4 or 5 other organizations. So if I'm working, say, for example, with team C, which is the far white letters at the top, I will show them at least 4 other teams, leadership teams, and where their averages are on each of these various categories. I want them to see that everybody's is not that great. Everybody's not that hot when it comes to scores. Rarely do you find scores in the leadership bar consistently in most leadership teams. We all have our strengths. We also all have our weaknesses. So I kind of give them this sense of comparison. I will call out on this particular sheet all those scores which fall outside of that overall leadership bar. And I put those in red, and I'll cut those in white that fall inside that bar. I also start alerting them to the fact that, while it might seem unusual, the 2 that are in blue at the very top and the bottom, self-regard and optimism, all the data shows that people who score high in self-regard and optimism at the leadership level are much more successful than anybody else. They are the 2 success indices across the board, which are quick to highlight and quick to identify. So self-regard and optimism, I get them thinking about those scores. So I show them this initial data just to see how they compare about with someone else. Now let's get specific in terms of hiring. Next one, please. In the process of doing this, this is our own sense of self-awareness, right? It depends upon how much we know. What do we know about the industry? What do we know about that particular kind of organization? Do we know about nonprofits? Do we know about the commercial sector? We work with Fortune 500 companies. And what's our backgrounds? What our knowledge level is? What's our experience? Real sense of humility has to enter into this too, because we're making some judgments about people just based on numbers on a page. And so we try and explain that too as we work with a client. The broader business sector experience we have, I think the more we're capable of doing this successfully with organizations. And I think we have to be aware of our own arrogance, our own emotional intelligence biases, things that we do well and not do well. I know empathy, for example, has not been a highlight of my life. And I've had to work at that with the help of other people around me all the time, including this morning. So it's just not me. So I know that going in. And I want to know my biases. Those of you who work with the Myers-Briggs type indicator, you know, each of the 16 types has its own bias. I'm an INTJ. I project intellectual arrogance, I know. And so I've got to watch that all the time. So we know this going in. Next slide, please. So if I worked with a leadership development program, and any kind of leadership program internally, I would have this data. And I want to, again, show this to the leadership team as a way of helping them understand what the organization looks like vis-a-vis their culture. And I've pulled these averages out, and again, to see where sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's low, sometimes it's high. What does that mean? Again, look at self-regard and optimism. If you just compare culture G with culture C, culture G, overall this team, really low sense of self-regard and lower sense of optimism. Team C, high sense of self-regard, high sense of optimism. And I don't do this to point fingers at one team versus the other, but again, to give them a sense of what their culture looks like. So as they begin to identify the high points and the low points, what they want, what they do, what they need, they begin to see that they are unique in this marketplace and their needs are different from other people. Okay, let's get specific. Next slide, please. So here, this is a recent gig we had, finding 3 candidates for an HR manager, human resources manager. We have 3 candidates coming out. I call them C1, C2, C3. We will have worked with the team initially, worked with the leadership, with the human resources leadership team. I put those scores to the far right. At the top, I also capture what the overall emotional intelligence is for each of these groups. So just see the existing team, the HR team at the far right, overall average for emotional intelligence is 121. You will know that from your work, I'm sure. That's a pretty high score, overall emotional intelligence. But overall, they know what they do. They do it pretty well. It's an exciting team, as a matter of fact. It's about 16 people. As I recall, the 16 people, I think there are 10 women, 6 men, about 3 different cultures. It's a neat team, and they do it pretty well. So that's the team I'm working with. That's the team this new candidate is going to join as an HR manager. I've also worked with the HR team on the far right to have them identify through our time together what they think the most important skill sets are in terms of emotional capacity for a new person to have coming in. And I've identified those in blue. So the ones they say are the most important for them, it's emotional self-awareness, it is being assertive, it's a sense of independence, empathy, social responsibility, and problem solving. They're all critical. And this particular organization is a fairly stressful one. And so having good stress tolerance is also very important. So they've identified going in that a successful candidate being hired should do pretty well in these categories. That's what they want. They also recognize there's some areas where they can improve things. So take the fourth one down from the top, for example, emotional expression. They may know how they feel, they just don't communicate it very well. They're pretty stoic. You talk to these people, sometimes the expression doesn't even change their face from time to time. So they know that's kind of needed on the team. Self-regard, the very top, one of the very important ones. The overall team, they score 103. That's a good score for general population. But they know they can do better. So in this regard, I see candidate 3 with 118 in that regard. That might be a very, very helpful choice. Good on the very bottom of the page. HR team scores 125 on optimism. I'll come back to optimism in a few minutes. Candidate 3, 98. Candidate 2, 92. They're statistically insignificant. But candidate 2, 129. That's pretty good. That's a pretty high score. So I'm drawn to that candidate initially until I see some other scores. Next page, please. So what I call it for him next is just overall, I put into green those which are under the leadership bar, which I find to be positives for these candidates. I put into red those lower scores, which I find may not be helpful and may show a lack of success on this particular team. So we take candidate 1, overall emotional intelligence score of 92. That is just above the norm, by the way, for the general population. And what we know is that leaders score about 10 to 15 points higher than the general population. So that's about a population norm. So they have 6, 7, 8 different categories there in which they score outside the bar. Take candidate 2. Again, I'm initially drawn to this candidate because of this score in flexibility and the score in optimism, which is really kind of interesting. And they're pretty good at building interpersonal relationships. But when you look at it, like problem solving, which is about 2/3 of the way down the page, problem solving, they're in 89. It's one of the lowest ones. This is a group that has to solve problems for senior leadership. Senior leadership does not need to have people running to their front door for every problem. That's the HR's job. They're going to stop those problems there. So they don't do well there. Empathy. Having a 91 score for empathy is not a great score for a human resources manager who has to deal with people all the time. And people are very, very different, particularly in an internet corporation. We're understanding diversity and inclusion, and they actually mean it. They actually mean it in this organization. Are very important. And there's several other red scores as well. And then I go to candidate 3. First of all, I'm struck by all the green scores. So all the green scores say this is a nice fit. This seems to be a nice fit for this organization. What I'm concerned about is impulse control. Does this person just fly by the seat of their pants all the time? Or do they actually value processes and systems in the process of doing things? So that's a problematic area for me. And the lack of optimism. So I look at optimism and impulse control as 2, in my mind, negatives for this candidate. But there are also 2 categories which are absolutely teachable. You give me these people for 3 months and I will improve those categories instantaneously. They're easy to improve. I also on this page have gathered 3 other pieces of the data. On the far right column, I have a little plus mark next to the 3 categories that the HRVP herself said for her and her boss, the CEO, are the most important categories in their business. So she's been kind of assigned those, and she agrees with that herself. So being assertive, being independent, and having a sense of authority are critical for her. She knows that she herself is fairly opinionated, as is the CEO. And she knows that she needs people who are willing to say, you know what? I know we have 3 or 4 options on the table here. I know you and the boss think number 2 is the right one. Let me tell you again why number 3 is the right choice. To be assertive about that and be independent in their decision making, they value that in this organization. So I need to know that going in. So what this page again just kind of captures my positive thoughts, my negative thoughts, my expectations, and what their expectations is going in as a review. So next page, please. So I recommend number 3. I recommend number 3 for the kind of reasons I talked about before. I recommend number 3 primarily because of the green scores here. I recommend it because of the keen sense of self-regard, which is a real hallmark for successful leaders, particularly in this particular industry. Keen sense of who they are as a person. This emotional self-awareness is critical. And you know, we teach people, it's one thing to know that you feel upset, angry, but you know why. If you really figure that out. And this person has a keen sense of being able to figure that out. They're independent as all get out. They have a keen sense of empathy. And this organization, as we all know, most senior leaders have a tough time with that one. Whether male or female, in regards to the culture, it's not a hallmark of most senior organizations. But this one, 106, not bad, but it's an important one. And 108, independence, great. Empathy, 124, really important. And so despite the fact there are 3 red scores there, and there always will be some red scores, by the way, always will be, we recommend number 3. And I make number 2 our second choice. So I rank order them, C3, C2, C1, and I send that recommendation off to the HRVP. Next slide, please. So with C3 recommended, I know they're going to have some final interviews. They'll have 1 or 2 interviews with their board of directors. They'll have an interview with the CEO. And after that, this particular person was in fact proffered the position. They suggested, though, that this individual consider some ongoing coaching while he's there. And they suggested particularly that I work with this candidate. That's not always the case. It just happened to be one here. And they assigned me a 6-month time frame to do some work with this candidate. And we work on specifically, by the way, the bottom one of the page, optimism, impulse control, and flexibility. They're the ones I think that we saw the most problematical on the initial list. Sometimes the candidate, again, prepares an action plan and works with the HRVP and the president doing just that. And I'll work with them also to revise that action plan and make sure that there's some very specific, identifiable, actionable items that they can work to improve upon in the coming time frame. And I ask them and also the HRVP to hold me accountable for having gotten these things done. And then we work with them, first of all, to identify what their strengths are, because as I'm sure you all know from work with Lisa, you don't just take one of these categories and bore in that one category. These are all kind of linked. They're interrelated with things. And the best way we find to do that is to see what they're good at doing, their real strengths, and use their strengths to leverage their growth in other areas. And we looked again, specifically this one, on optimism, impulse control, and flexibility. Optimism is going to be the big one that's going to make this person successful or not successful right away. I hope some of you know who Coach K is. If you follow college basketball at all, you know Coach K. It's Mike Krzyzewski. He's the Duke University basketball coach. Could we go to the next slide just quickly for a minute? Mike was a year behind me at West Point. We were squash partners, as a matter of fact, at the academy for several years. And Mike's written several books on leadership. And one of his books, he says, a good coach is somebody who always knows what face to show the team. I think that's a fabulous leadership mantra as well. And that's what we talk about in terms of optimism with these folks. It's not just as the cup half empty, as the cup half full, but day by day, as we're stuck staying at home in this COVID nonsense, or the budget's been cut, or the wrong person's in the Oval Office, or whatever the issue happens to be for you, what face do you show the team? Does that face say, oh, we're done for now, losing market share, we'll drop it by a third, start firing people now? Or do we start saying, you know what, we're going to get through this, and this is why we're going to get through this, and you show the right face to the team at the right time. That's a very important face to show. Can we back up one slide, please, Lisa? And so optimism is one. Impulse control is another one. This person didn't show a lot of impulse control, candidate number 3. So I want to work on improving that one. This is somebody who probably just, they run by their gut. This is Leroy Jethro Gibbs, if you know NCIS, right? He just goes in the gut all the time and doesn't really trust the processes and the systems enough to do this. This is one, and there's several here that are probably typologically related. Certain types tend to have less or more impulse control than others. And then we also work on flexibility. So again, I picked those 3 because we can improve upon these. And inside of 6 months, this person will be top contributor to the organization, no doubt in my mind. Next slide, please, or 2 slides from now. And we go to the next one too. And social responsibility, just one more I want to highlight very, very quickly, because social responsibility does not just mean, do you recycle? Do you work with the local Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts? Do you coach the league baseball? It's also, once you do your job, you do your job as a human resources manager, but what obligation do you also have to help build the team you're on? And that's the part we'd like to work on. We can really coach that one. Anybody can make believe about is the cup half empty or half full. But this one, this is a coaching skill that page 2 in your form, of course, will point out to you. Next slide, please. And then, so for ongoing EI development, we can always offer ongoing development for people, but it really depends upon their own desire to change. If they don't have a desire to change, anything we do is not going to be successful anyway. So we need to make sure that they have a desire to change. We have to look at the quality of their action plan to make sure that the things they select are very actionable. They really will contribute to the leadership acumen. They really will assist the organization. So the quality of the action plan is critical. Sometimes all that demands is a peer coaching. You find somebody internally who wants to work with you. But you want to work with HR to ensure the process. It takes personal work. It takes an internal coach, a mentor, peer coaching. One of the corporations we worked in California recently, after we worked with the leadership team for 2 days, the CEO turned to the CFO and said, look, I see you did really well on empathy. I don't do that well at all. Will you work with me? And they decided to pair up with each other on the senior leadership team to coach one another on these various competencies around emotional intelligence. That's fabulous when that happens. Rarely happens, but it's fabulous when it does. And so that internal peer coaching, I think, is really the ideal process. But if not the case, then they always have us to fall back on. Next slide, please. And what I wanted to do is to find somebody to coach them who is on the same mission that they are. That's not always an outside coach. It's not always an inside coach. You want to find some coach that'll work with this person who really knows what the job is all about, what they need to do to change, and wants to help them solve that problem for them. Next slide. So here's our final thoughts. So what's our role in development? First of all, the onus is on us, right, to be as knowledgeable as possible. That means we study. We don't just get certified. We study. We stay in contact with Lisa. We attend all these meetings we possibly can. You learn as much as you can. You read every book you can on emotional intelligence. You invade the websites on emotion and find those that are bad and throw them away, and find the good ones and see how you can help people change if they want to change. We got to pursue our own personal ongoing development. We have to know the individual categories, the 15 categories that Lisa began us with, and know the most important ways and effective ways to improve each. And again, sometimes that means raising our capabilities, and sometimes it means decreasing our dependence. You find somebody, for example, who scores really high on stress management, not management, I forget the word. It was stress, whatever that word is, stress. Oh. That's it. And really low on empathy. You probably just found somebody whose sweat doesn't bother them, stress doesn't bother them at all. But meanwhile, people around them are just dying. They're just sucking gas. And so the relation between the scores is very, very important also. So sometimes it means decreasing dependence in some of the categories. It means recognizing the interplay. And it means that we ourselves who work with candidates have to model as best we can really emotionally intelligent behavior. And again, that's easier said than done. And we need to solicit feedback all we possibly can in the process. So that's just my final thoughts. So that's about development and selection. Selection, I know, is probably something many of you have not done before. I think it can be done and done well. It can be done ethically. 342, I'm told, as of this morning, candidates we have hired for major corporations through this one search firm. Everyone is still there but one. That one left because of a health issue. Everyone is still there. And so I know it can be done successfully. But the onus on us is to do it ethically and to do it the right way as well. I am more than happy if you have any questions that try and deal with them.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Bill. I think this has been a great presentation. And, you know, speaking for myself, I've never been involved in doing selection of candidates, but I've certainly been a manager in my past life where I had to hire people and fire people. And I think if I had had this process, I would have felt a whole lot more comfortable, that's for sure. So thank you for sharing this. I think this is like a well-oiled machine. It sounds like you've developed here. And so kudos to you and to your team. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. So at this time, I would just like to invite any practitioner that's interested in joining the conversation to do so. Please ask your questions or make your observations or comments. You can also put these in the chat box and I'll try to keep track of that. But be sure to unmute yourself and introduce yourself and ask your questions, share your comments or observations. Anyone? Well, if not, I'm gonna jump in, because what I really appreciated about this process that you laid out was introducing the whole idea of culture and how to use culture as a part of this whole process. It just felt like right from the very beginning, it's a really positive way to build trust in the organization and also trust with the candidates. I mean, to be so forthcoming and honest about what this culture is really like so that people can make good choices and good decisions for themselves was really, it's pretty impressive. And I think that it just also reinforces that transparency and authenticity and the way you frame it in the idea of confidentiality. I mean, you spoke so much about holding the candidates' confidentiality as well as the organizations. I just really appreciate all the effort that you go to help these people feel comfortable. And I think that allows them to open up as well. So that was the one thing that I took away from it.
Well, thanks. What it really does, it helps us work with the candidates, but it also helps us, it helps the candidate know what kind of organization they're joining. That here, I'm joining this organization who cares enough to have some guy spend 2 hours with me on just this issue, that they want to know that I really do care about making those contacts, the emotional involvement, as well as just the more statistical approach to life. They love it. And they love knowing the candidates and that the companies appreciate them for who they are as people, which is an unusual thing.
So I'm seeing that we have a question from Tom. He says, Bill, do you find any significant differences between cultures? For example, in looking at candidates between several sections of the globe, I have found some material differences in scores.
Mm-hmm. I find them, yes, this is a quick answer to your question. And the specific categories that I have found are ones around assertiveness and independence and empathy, particularly in Asian cultures, Southwest Asian cultures, and also Latin American cultures. To generalize really generally, Asians in general, but particularly Asian females, have been taught to be, by their culture, less assertive, less independent. They're less likely to advance themselves. Whereas good old white males in our culture, we're going to blow our own horn every chance we get. And in our culture, women will not do that, and also Asians will not do that. Likewise, in Latin American cultures, and I'm just picking on 2 or 3 categories, I realize that, you find the female Latina is less likely to blow her own horn, not to assert herself, whereas the male Latino is out there in front all the time. I mean, nobody's better than I am. And so there are obviously generalities, but that enters into the scores, in remarkable ways. And they will often ask that question. I find they raise that question themselves. I just recently worked with another HR manager who she herself was born and raised in this country by a Japanese family. And she found that to be so true, even being raised in this culture the entire time. At home, she heard something different. So those categories are oftentimes ones that are impacted by it. Empathy, I have found, is not a big factor in those Southwest Asian countries that I worked with. I really have to encourage them to be more understanding of others' differences, but more important than understand and empathizing with it, demonstrating to the other person they actually do understand that difference. And that's usually where the breakout happens to be. Mm-hmm. So I hope that answered your question. They're the ones that I find most significant. I would wish we had more data on the various cultures. I mean, it's one of the things, just in passing, I did an article on LinkedIn this some time ago. Just look at males and females just for a second. Here's what we find. Male and a female both enter the same company, so they both enter Caterpillar at the same time. Fresh out of college, both engineers, male and female. Across the board, women always score higher than do men. Why? Because women have been allowed by our culture in North America, allowed to understand emotions more so than guys. Guys, boys don't cry, knock it off. There's no crying in baseball. All those little shibboleths we tried out from time to time. So you join the organization, women always score higher than men. Put those same 2 people in that same organization for 10 years. Give them the EQI again. The male always outscores the woman. Why? Because most organizations are still in this country largely male at the top. They've had more opportunities for having a male coach, a male mentor. Males are less likely to want to coach a younger female, particularly the whole Me Too movement, afraid of what's going to happen in that relationship. And so as a result, the guys have had a greater chance to be coached than have the women. Then you give them 10 more years in the organization, because the woman has worked twice as hard as the guy to get there. The women, once again, and the male are kind of on a par with scores. Successful ones score the same. But in the interim, there's a huge difference. So I always want to know, how old is this person? How long they've been in the organization? Because that does impact the scores also. It's another cultural issue that's very, very important.
And we're adaptive creatures, so we will adapt to our environment.
That's right. Somebody just said, preach.
Yeah.
Amen, sister.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm looking at the clock. I want to be respectful of our time together here. So I will invite anybody that has one last question to either put it in the chat box or unmute yourself and introduce yourself and ask the question. And if not, I am going to close the session. Anyone?
Lisa, it's Mary Steeper Reinhout. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. You have a question for Bill? Or?
I do, very concretely. Bill, you'd mentioned that you, with the client's permission, will share the profile, the results, the report with the client organization. Which of those things? Do you actually forward a set of reports to a client organization?
Yes and no. If they give me permission to forward the results, I will tell them I'm going to forward the results directly to the search firm who identified them for me. And I get their permission to do just that. I have worked with the senior managers and all the search firms, again, so that they understand the EQI as well. That search firm then will meet with that individual after our conversation and very well ask them if they can then forward it on to the hiring organization. That's the process I prefer to use. If they want to give me permission right away to forward it to both, I will do that as well. Here's a little caveat to that. Some of the organizations I work with, and I'm sure you find this to be the case yourself, internally, HR likes to get a data back on various folks. And if they've been trained in the EQI, they will probably set up a file of executives, what their scores are on the EQI. Many companies do that. I will not send 5 reports of potential candidates to an HR department in an organization because I don't know which one's going to be hired.
Excellent.
And before
Yeah.
they're not hired, they have no
Yep.
right to have that person's report. So I have to be
That's
very clear what the process is.
Thank you. That's, yeah, I'm supportive of that. I wasn't sure if you distribute in mass. So
No, I do not.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you all. I am going to close our session, but before I do, I want to just say a few things before we sign off here. First of all, I want to thank Bill for sharing his perspective and experience in applying emotional intelligence to both selection and development. It was a really good session, Bill, so thank you for that.
My pleasure.
As you probably know, Crescendo Connect Conversations are one of the benefits EI practitioners receive when they are certified by Crescendo Inc. Other benefits include access to our members-only resource center and exclusive discounts to Crescendo Inc. sponsored training programs. I wanted to let you know that our next Crescendo Connect is scheduled for Wednesday, November 11th. You'll get an announcement on this in the next few weeks, but our topic is emotional intelligence and intercultural agility. As a reminder, if you are making the EI connection to your practice and are willing to share it with our community, I want to hear from you. We're working on putting together our schedule for next week, or for next year. And I'm looking for ideas and suggestions from our practitioners. And thanks again for coming to our session today. I really appreciate it. We do have, if there's anybody on the call that has not yet been EQI certified, we have a virtual certification taking place starting in November. And I encourage you to reach out to me as soon as possible because we are closing registration by the end of next week and I need to know. Bill and I are going to stay on the call here for the next few minutes. If you have some additional questions, we're happy to answer them. But in the meantime, thanks again. And we look forward to connecting with you again for future Crescendo Connect conversations. Thanks guys.
Everybody.
Take good care.
Thank you.